Welcome, everybody, to the Finance Essentials podcast. I am your host, Danny Hudson. With me is a special guest today, Miss Elizabeth Crouch. Please say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Now, Elizabeth is a Division Vice President of Sales for Major Accounts for a leading human capital management firm. She has actually been with them for about 13 years. She started off as a senior district manager, then worked her way up to a sales executive, up to the VP of sales, then into the division vice president of sales for small business services, and then into the division vice president of sales, major accounts, over the course of 13 years. So way to go, Elizabeth. That's a very nice resume that you've managed to accumulate there.
Thanks, Danny. You make me feel very old with that.
Well, not a lot of people can say that they've been at places for 13 years and moved up that many positions. So that's pretty good. So for the audience out there, what is a human capital management firm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would tell you that it's an organization who helps companies lead their human capital. So if you think of human capital, those are their most important asset, which are their employees. So you think of all the things that go into managing and developing an employee. We help with everything. So a very comprehensive solution to helping, whether it be a CEO, a CFO, a CHRO, HR practitioners, so many different layers of an organization really leverage our firm for support with their employee personnel.
Great. And then as far as your progression within the company, what has your roles been from the ground level all the way up to where you are now?
Yeah, I started as a sales associate. So right out of college, I sold for the firm and just worked my way up kind of the lateral corporate, positions, as they say. So I led a team of sales reps directly, and then I led a region. And then as my role as a DVP of sales, I covered multiple regions, and I've had this role in 2 separate business units now at this point.
So at this point then in your career, how many people would you say probably roll up to you?
Well, my former role in small business, I had about 350 people that reported into me, and my role in major accounts, there's about 150. So we have fewer associates.
There's less firms, right? Less exposure to outside. That makes a lot of sense. So
exactly.
The book of business is probably larger, but because it's a smaller collection of accounts, therefore you don't necessarily need as many people managing it.
That's exactly correct.
Perfect. And so now with the exposure that you have to the current business climate and what you've been doing over the course of, the last decade or so, what are some big areas that you have seen shift and change since COVID? And then how are you starting to see those businesses develop as we're hopefully coming out of it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, COVID has created such a challenge for business owners and the C-suite in general. You think about companies who have thrived in an environment where all of their employees came to the same place every single day. Overnight, they were tasked with figuring out how to have a remote workforce. Mm-hmm. And not just from a productivity standpoint at the employee level, but how do we manage employees remotely? How do we ensure that we can communicate effectively with them? How do we ensure that they have the tools and technology they need remotely to do their work? Mm-hmm. And then aside from that, in an environment where remote work really isn't possible, how do you reimagine your business or shift completely so that you don't completely stop revenue from coming in, where you have to shut your doors?
Yeah.
So I think depending on the industry, depending on the business owner, they've been impacted vastly differently. What we've seen in the market is we have so many clients who have really thrived because they've been able to reimagine their business through this devastating experience. And then naturally...
Do you have some specific examples of some industries that you may have seen that have been able to do well?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. We have a client who formerly would do signs for businesses, mm-hmm. and work basically came to a halt when COVID hit. And so they pivoted and figured out how to create the touchless hand sanitizer stations and started selling those in the interim.
That's interesting.
So business picked back up. So as you can imagine, I mean, that's a 180, right? That's
absolutely
a completely different business than what they were familiar with.
Sure.
They had to think creatively. And I believe that one of the greatest values that America has is our entrepreneurial spirit. Whether that means that you own a business or you work in a Fortune 500 or larger or smaller rather company, we have the ability to think creatively and to think outside the box. And I think your owners who have done that have really thrived in this environment. But those who have really lived in a box and have struggled have had a very difficult time.
Right.
And it's also
one of the examples that a couple of podcasts ago, I went through a list that basically said these industries are struggling a little bit as far as adjusting. And the big one was like brunch and breakfast restaurants, right? Limited exposure, very dependent on a specific type of market, things along those lines. The sign business was a great example. Have you seen some other ones that have struggled, some other industries and types of businesses that have really struggled to make that pivot?
I think all things travel related have really been hit. You go into an airport now and it's a ghost town.
Sure.
In fact, I haven't been to an airport in months because I used to travel every single week pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So professionally, the airport was like a home to me, and I haven't been in one in so many months. But I have a couple of friends who have done some traveling, and when we've talked about it, they've shared that it's a ghost town when you go into an airport. But aside from just airport, think of all things travel related.
Yes.
I mean, just anything related to traveling, whether it be through business or pleasure, has really taken a huge hit. And it's hard to pivot when you can't get people to your location. Right. I mean, I know that a lot of these different organizations are trying to think about how do we long-term plan to get people out in our organization in 2021. I've got several friends in the hotel industry that have just been completely hammered, by the pandemic. And it's just hard. If you can't bring people in, it's kind of hard to pivot if you're a Marriott, right? It's a little bit difficult.
To make hand sanitizing stations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I also think organizations are figuring out how to be productive in a much leaner environment.
Right.
So, and it's scary for people like you and I, Danny, who have many years of experience, right? And we're probably in the top heavy portion of an organization, as they start to think about ways that they can increase profits because revenues are down. I mean, cutting costs is a big way to do that. And so as you think about the layers of leadership that so many organizations have, I think companies are really trying to reimagine how do we skinny that down a little bit, which there in turn puts on more work on the people who are left.
Yep. So
then how do you make sure that they're still productive and efficient? Do they have the tools that they need to be productive and efficient? So it's a very tough position to be in if you're running a business right now. There is no doubt about it. A lot of people are just white knuckling it.
Yeah, they're just doing what they can to hope that, the V-shaped recovery
make it on the other side
and that kind of thing. Yeah, I know. One of the other things that I talk a lot about on the show is industries, and you bring up a good one with hotels, is the types of industries that are very capital intensive. Right. So again, using hotels as an example, but another obviously one is restaurants, movie theaters, things where they own a large facility with a lot of fixed costs. One of the other areas too that you bring up as far as top heavy organization that also is people are probably looking at is facilities. Right. You have facility staff that you employ to keep places clean, and if you never go back to 100% capacity again, are those departments potentially in jeopardy? So you're right. I mean, it is very, where you look at cutting costs is a very big issue.
Well, as you think about that, I mean, if you consider commercial real estate, I mean, there's a lot of businesses out there that are evaluating and thinking, we've done this remote work for quite some time now, and we've gotten pretty good at it.
Yeah.
Do we need to be paying for this ridiculous lease for our employees to come into from a home office or a work office, perspective? It's funny. There was a senior leader at the organization I work at that defined it as we're no longer working from home. We're now living at work.
Yeah.
And that's really the reality kind of we're all living in.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
But I think business owners are really questioning, do we need to be spending all of this money on just having a place for our employees to come and work daily?
Sure.
But I know for me in sales, as an example, I mean, I know my teams and I are desperately excited to get back into the office, if you can believe that.
Right.
You know,
Having two small kids also helps.
Exactly. It certainly does. Well, they both go back to school now, thank goodness.
I know, talking to coworkers that don't have kids, they never want to go back. And
I know.
Ones that do have kids, and they're kind of like, yeah, I'd like to get back in maybe 2 or 3
times
a week.
Totally. Well, and you know, it's interesting because what we're struggling with and what I'm struggling with in my department and what I do is how do you create culture remotely with employees? It's a big struggle. I mean, it's, and then I'm also thinking about, you know, in my role, the longer that you stay with the organization, the more productive you become. That's just, it's an obvious statement, right? But especially in a sales environment, the more knowledge, the more experience, the more yeses and the more no's you get, you learn from and you become better. Mm-hmm. And I'm a little bit, I guess I could say uneasy about, you know, even those people that I've hired in the year of 2020. So think about being hired where you've never shook the hand of the person who hired you. You've never met them in person. You've never been able to go on a sales call with a peer in person. It's just a very unique world we're living in right now. Right. And it's one thing if you're electing to be in an inside sales type role, but if you're electing to be in an outside sales role, or you're electing to be in a career where this face-to-face interaction is vitally important, it's a very tough position to be in.
Right. No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I didn't even really think much about it from an outside sales perspective, because I work in finance. And so, you know, most of the exposure that I have is kind of all internal clients. And the teams, a lot of times that I have supported, the people that the companies that they support is relatively small. So the relationships for the most part are already established. And so, you know, there's not necessarily a new handshake to, hey, you know, say, hey, it's nice to meet you. It's, we've been working with these guys for 100 years.
Yes.
That kind of thing. So that's a very interesting thing I didn't really think about as far as establishing those relationships from the ground up and not having any type of physical contact or physical exposure to them whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So now again, being on the finance side of things, and supporting a lot of sales teams and things, obviously we would be considered overhead. We wouldn't necessarily directly drive, you know, top line, bottom line kind of thing. What's the relationship with your organization and yourself to finance, and how do you guys leverage that relationship to drive and build your forecasts and your budgets and so on?
Yeah, so the first part of your question is the relationship between sales and finance can obviously be sometimes a contentious one.
Sure. Don't give that discount. No, we don't make any money if you give that discount.
Exactly. It's very funny that you say that, because that was one of the first things that came to mind is, you know, always building a business case as to why we need a new client. And, you know, I will tell you, especially in the COVID environment, all of our processes, it feels like, are highly competitive now. Sure. You know, owners are looking for ways to drive value, but also cut costs. And, you know, there's a lot of soft cost negotiation that goes into what we do naturally, right? And as well as hard costs. But so from a relationship standpoint, as I said, it can be a little bit of a contentious one. From a forecasting standpoint, again, very interesting that you asked that question, because COVID has changed everything. So typically we look at historical forecasts from years prior, quarters prior, month, you know, year over year in the given month. We look at the growth numbers per month. The COVID's changed everything.
Yep.
Now we're asking ourselves, well, is a positive growth number good? Is a negative growth number good? And how much market share growth should we have? So it's a very, you know, it's a very tough position to be in to try to estimate what's going to be coming in, because this year, unlike any year before, is really unpredictable.
Sure.
But what I will tell you is prospects we're hearing more and more is, I think people have a little bit of COVID fatigue, and they're ready to kind of move on.
Right.
And they're ready to have their business reimagined and go back to work and have a sense of normalcy, whether it be with or without a mask.
Sure.
Back in their place of employment and their place of work. So, you know, we're having a lot more success. We're getting in a lot more doors. Prospects are more willing to meet now than they have really since February onwards. So we're feeling that sense of normalcy, but from a forecasting standpoint, it still creates its own challenges, because you can't compare a pandemic year
Oh,
to
absolutely.
any other year from a
Yeah,
finance.
we're currently going through the budgeting process now, where a lot of the senior leadership are basically saying, "Hey, we want to hold flat to 2020 regarding specific types of costs, travel, entertainment, things along those lines." And we're having to push back and basically say, "Look, to your point, in a sales industry, we didn't travel, we didn't visit sales, our clients, we didn't visit any customers. To be able to hold steady to 2020 doesn't make any sense, because we had
Mm-hmm.
all of these savings from not actually having to do anything."
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to go into a next year and operate at that same level is essentially impossible. And so
Absolutely.
from a finance perspective, there's been a lot of very close relationships with the business, to where we're trying to put that story together so we can go to leadership and say, "Hey, look, our sales folks, they haven't visited anybody. If you don't want them to visit anybody going forward, then that's the decision you're going to make. And we're going to have to build out the business case of all of these relationships that we could potentially lose."
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
that kind of thing. So you're right. It's kind of that relationship there where, finance and sales, you want to be like this, but you also have to be like this,
For
because,
sure.
it's a lot of give and take kind of in there. But I will say, coming from a finance perspective and supporting sales teams as long as I have, I like interacting with the sales teams. They teach me all kinds of stuff. For example, where I'm at right now, a lot of our salespeople are former engineers. They were engineers that helped construct the products and everything along those lines, and then they turn around and want to sell them. So even from a finance perspective, your sales people are generally sometimes your best resources, right? They're going to know more about what you're putting business cases together, than anybody else.
Absolutely.
So I
It's funny,
really
we like to joke that, finance is very conservative except for when you submit your forecast. And they,
yeah.
they
Uh-huh.
expect that you are very aggressive.
That is
and,
true.
and you
Well,
get peppered with several questions as to why
exactly. Well, for us,
your
a lot of
forecast is
times it's,
conservative.
the pushback that we get is no, 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 no. We want costs to be zero, and then we want profitability to be infinite. So
Sure.
go put that together. And it's like, well, that doesn't
Can you
exist.
solve that equation, please?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, we had a circumstance several months ago where the sales team that I supported, they got guidance from executive leadership that was basically saying, "So this is what we want to do. We want to increase market share, we want to decrease cost, and we want to increase profitability. So go do that."
Well,
And
everybody wants to do that.
yeah,
I mean,
exactly. And I'm like, if that's the guidance, I could be an executive, because I'll just tell everybody that, you know, and if they do it, that'll make me look great.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and if you think about that, what you're asking is for your sales folks to be increasingly more productive,
hmm
way more efficient. And I think the answer is, or I think the question is, how do you do that? And I don't think we have the answer.
Right.
You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And especially again in this environment, it's like, how do you get people more productive with less? And I think we're learning how to do that. I mean, even with sales as an example, in my industry, in my business, we're in outside sales. And a big part of how we get appointments with prospects is by walking in the door
Sure.
and having something valuable to share that is thought leadership or something that we know is a trigger event with the organization we're walking into.
hmm
That's been completely taken out of our arsenal.
Sure.
And frankly, you have to ask yourself, when is it appropriate for us to just cold walk into a business,
Right.
right? It's one thing to get a meeting with a CFO, a CEO, a CHRO, and they ask, can we have this meeting in person? And if both parties are comfortable to have that meeting in person.
Sure.
But what if you walk into a prospect who is very conservative with this situation and is really uncomfortable? Well,
Right.
now you've created a branding issue. And are you going to be able to get back in the door with that prospect?
Sure.
So kind of leading off of the productivity piece, it's like, how do you become more productive and more efficient? And we've taken a big part of how you prospect out of your bag of goods.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Right. That makes
And
that makes
as you can
sense.
imagine, I mean, the C-suite is being attacked from salespeople at every angle, right? No matter what industry, no matter what business, and we're all doing the same things: calling, emailing, LinkedIn.
hmm
So how do you sound unique and different to get them to read your email, to acknowledge it, to be willing to meet,
Sure.
right? So it's just a very tough time in sales, I think, in every industry. I don't want to
have
take
you
away
guys
from
been able to, because where my head would go in that scenario is not necessarily retraining, but additional training, right? Like I would think that there would probably be, maybe it's internal, maybe it's external, but training that would be provided to the sales teams that say, hey, we're going to spend a day or two doing this type of training that's going to help increase your guys' skills and abilities to be able to do this new type of sales and marketing, at least in the interim until, we may never go back, but in the interim, to be able to provide the productivity that you guys are wanting, but using those different types of avenues. Have you guys kind of provided the tools?
Absolutely. We realized quickly, especially with an outside sales force, that we had to pivot and make sure that they understood how to effectively run a sales call remotely.
Sure.
And it's even little things. You'll notice I have a virtual background on right now,
right,
but
your COVID background.
it is, I wish my place looked this amazing right now, but, but little things like a virtual background or going on video, even if your prospect is not on video, or just little nuances and things that you lose without that face-to-face meeting that you can somewhat gain back, not fully,
sure,
but you can compensate for somewhat in a virtual environment. And naturally, as I said earlier, I mean, I feel for my sales reps because they didn't elect to be in a virtual environment. They specifically chose to be in outside sales.
Sure,
So
they wanted the travel. They wanted
the face-to-face interaction, and so many of them thrive in that. And 80% of what you say doesn't come out of your mouth. I think that's the quote that runs around everywhere, I feel. But you lose a lot of that ability to read nonverbal communication and read buying cues. And so absolutely, to answer your question in a long-winded way, we definitely had to quickly kind of pick up the pieces and say, are our reps equipped to run virtual meetings? No. And so what do we need to do to get them prepared and confident so that they can sell in this environment? And again, going back to those new hires, this is all that they know until we return. So it's a very unique time. And I'll be very interested to see how those young associates transition back out to the field who have never been hired in the field in this 2020 calendar year.
And how has the response been from the team? I'm sure at first it was probably very stressful. People were probably very overwhelmed because, just because, COVID happens and situations change, sales targets don't always necessarily change, that kind of thing. So how have they responded?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, it's interesting. It's almost like feast or famine. I have reps who are just knocking it out of the park despite COVID. And I have reps who are really struggling to kind of get anything going.
Yeah.
And I think similarly to business owners, the sales reps who have been creative, who have thought outside the box, who have reimagined their role, have done extremely well and have not missed a beat. The ones who have lived in a box and have kind of stayed the course and not changed their process and their messaging at all have really, really struggled. And so, you've also got competing interests at home. I have some people who have no distractions and it's just them single, as we kind of joked about earlier in our call. And I've got some who have kids at home. And so I know for me personally, I really felt a transition of back to normalcy, if we can even call it that, when my kids return to school. Yeah. And I think you're seeing that across the United States, right? I mean, all of the US goes back at different times, but you're seeing your friends on social media platforms share that their kids are finally back in person after a few weeks of virtual.
They all have a party.
Exactly. I know my children are back in school in person. And so that's really been able to create a sense of normalcy for me. But I know for the people that I work with who haven't had that luxury of having their children return, it's been very difficult. It is very difficult to manage those personal aspects of your life while trying to professionally hold up a very intense and a stressful career. I mean, sales is stressful no matter what industry or business you work for.
Yeah.
But it's again, I just keep using the word reimagine because the associates who have done a nice job of doing that have not skipped a beat.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. And hopefully the relationships are there too, to where, people aren't necessarily afraid to reach out to the ones that have had success, or the ones that have had success have been able to kind of share, their experiences and help out other folks on the team who, maybe they see that they're struggling or things along those lines to try to help them out as well.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, because now more than ever, we're doing our best to communicate a lot collectively as a division.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making sure that I am sharing value across the division when I'm hearing things that are working, because no sense in recreating the wheel, right? I mean, I'd love to see my reps be able to leverage what's working with their peer group that are successful, that are winning. And I think if they can make it their own and be creative and really own the message, then they'll be successful. But like I said, naturally, we've had our fair share of associates who have struggled.
Sure, I bet. Well, I've got time for one more.
Sure.
I know you mentioned earlier, COVID fatigue, people really wanting to kind of move on. One of the underlying messages that I really try to really push in this show is, how does that apply to me, right? So people that are listening and saying, I just listened to this interview for a half an hour. What does that have to do with me? So what can you share as far as what your outlook goes and how people can take the knowledge that you've learned over the period of time and your career to really help bring either their personal career, maybe their business to the next level in a post-COVID world where maybe we return to normal, maybe we don't quite return to normal, but something that they can leverage in their future career.
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on who's listening, whether it's an entrepreneur and a business owner, or it's a W-2 employee that's going to go back and work for an organization, I think you've got to consider, how do I think outside the box and voice my opinion and share it with my leaders so that I can show the value that I can bring to an organization, right? So as you return professionally to work, it's really critical that we bring value and we speak up of the things that we're hearing and that we're seeing, mm-hmm. right? I mean, the best voice that I can hear are my sales reps. I do remote regional visits now since I can't travel. And so I always spend the first 20 minutes of every meeting that I have with my smaller subgroups of associates asking, what are they hearing? What are they seeing? What do they need? Mm-hmm. And I think you've got to be willing to speak up to your bosses at this point in a respectful way, right? We've all heard the term managing up, but I think, again, if you're an employee, you've got to think about, how do I manage up and how do I have that conversation with my leaders
sure.
to help bring value to my firm?
Sure.
And if I'm an owner, I have to think, how do I reimagine my business to make sure that
sure.
I can come out even stronger than I did before? Mm-hmm. And how do I think creatively to be able to bring more customers in the door, whether it be with how you support your employees, whether it be your messaging as a company. So I think everyone has to return to the sense of normalcy with thinking about how they reimagine kind of what their role is at their place of employment, whether it is frontline employee or owner of the business.
Sure. Yeah. I know one of the messages I really try to hammer home is diversification, right? When we were talking earlier about one of the types of businesses that really struggle were your brunch and your breakfast restaurants, because like you talked about, they're inside of a box. And so one of the messages that I really try to push is diversification, whether it's revenue diversification, industry diversification, whatever you can do to make sure that you're not solely dependent upon one source of income.
Absolutely. Well, and even with the brunch example,
sales are kind of on the same wavelength when it comes to that.
I know. Well, it's like even with the brunch example, I mean, here in Central Florida, you've had so many of these restaurants get really creative, and they're creating mimosas to go in a box, sure. and a big box breakfast to go where you pick it up and bring it to your house.
Exactly.
And that's been, I think, a big hit for many of them. And I think historically you've had these, even like these high-end restaurants that never would do takeout because they were worried about quality control that are now willing to do it.
Yeah.
And hopefully they'll continue it because it's a great way to do business. And I certainly
like a margarita you can pick up on your way home at the Mexican place down the street.
Exactly. But it's really caused business owners and employees to rethink everything that they've known. And one last thing that I'll say is, especially for my industry, I think for the C-suite, they're realizing that they need technology now more than ever. Mm-hmm. And I think the old school way of thinking and running a business may not necessarily work in the post-COVID world.
Sure.
I think people are going to be expecting more flexibility at work. I think people are going to be expecting some sort of hybrid type role between being at home and being in the office.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're all just going to turn on a switch and everyone goes back to normal.
Sure.
I think there's going to be a kind of phased approach of that normalcy, whenever that might be. So business owners really are going to have to be ready to pivot. And I think employees also have to be ready to be flexible and nimble with the people they work for too,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
we're all being asked to do and
More
to
with
think
less,
differently.
like you said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Well, thank you for coming on. I really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
Do you have any like social media you want to plug or anything like that? Or
I mean, I don't. I don't. I think we're
I
okay.
wanted to
Hopefully,
ask just in case.
listen. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. If you follow me on social media, you'll probably only find fishing pictures and pictures of my kids at
That is
baseball.
true. There are a lot of fishing pictures and a lot of
So
pictures of
you
kids.
may not
Yeah.
be as excited to follow me on social media, except for on LinkedIn. You can find me at Elizabeth Crouch.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for coming. I had a great
Thanks,
time,
Danny.
and
You
all the
too.
best in the future.
You too.
All right, thanks.
Have a good one.